Kei ngā mana whenua o tēnei roki, ngā te kātua, ngā te paua me tainui waka, waikato iwi hoki. He mihi nui. Well, hello everybody, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And a big thank you especially to Glyn and Colin for inviting me here along tonight. Glyn has had an important role in significant moments in my life. When he was Vicar of St Andrews, he was involved in my wedding and in the funeral of my father-in-law. So Glyn's got a very special place in our family, and it's lovely to be here tonight talking a little bit about my book, which is called Shifting Grounds, Deep Histories of Tamaki, Makaurau, Auckland. Well, I grew up fairly close to here, but like many Aucklanders, I knew very little of the history of the city. My parents weren't from Auckland, so they had few connections with the place. And when I studied New Zealand history at school and university, there were no courses on Auckland history, or on urban history, or on local histories. That's beginning to change now with the introduction of the New Zealand History School curriculum. But as many of us heard in the media today, there's still a real lack of historical resources for teachers to draw on. Well, Auckland's home to 1/3 of the country's population, but like many cities in New Zealand, it's received relatively little attention from historians. And much of the history here remains unexamined and outdated. To this day, for example, there are still histories that repeat old 19th century tropes about the city's past. That Māori were constantly at war in the pre-colonial era, for instance. That Tamaki, known today as Auckland, had been abandoned by Māori and was empty when Pākehā first arrived in 1840. And that colonial Auckland was a little Britain, or a neo-Europe. Well, as well as a lack of historical research on Auckland, a lot of the city's physical or tangible history has also disappeared. Its volcanic cones, its rivers, its headlands, its landmarks have been destroyed over the years as the cities continue to spread and intensify. So it can sometimes be hard to make sense of Auckland from its physical landscape and from its written histories. So it wasn't until I started working as a public historian for local and central government, for museums, for iwi and hapu, that I began to learn about the deep and layered histories in Auckland. And those histories were often embedded in material or tangible things, in landscapes, in buildings, in churches, in monuments, in objects, in taonga. Those histories not found in the written sources that historians like to rely on, but found instead in layers on the land, in the stories passed down, in a neglected grove of trees, for instance. These places tell stories that have been crafted into land over time, but have often disappeared from the collective memory of a city. And in places such as the Otuataua stone fields, shown here, which is one of the places I worked on in the late 1990s, there were very different stories to the ones that I'd read about in books or seen in museums. These stories were long, complex and nuanced, and sometimes painful. They were still very present for certain communities and had shaped the wider city, yet they were unknown to most Aucklanders and most New Zealanders. And it's those stories that I wanted to write about. So those stories fed into a PhD thesis, which I finished about 5 years ago, and then they fed into the book, which was published in 2021. And they continue now really in my job as a historian and a curator at Auckland Museum, where I've been for the past 7 years. Those stories are fed into the exhibition that's on at the moment on Auckland at the museum, and they're now feeding into a project that I'm working on at the moment that uses local places and museum collections to explore histories of Auckland for the new history curriculum. There are so many unknown histories of Auckland that need to be told, and we're keen to keep telling them. So my book, Shifting Grounds, centres around histories in Tamaki, Makaurau, Auckland, but it's really as much about exploring the histories beneath our feet wherever we are. So the approach I've taken is to start with the ground diving deeply into particular places, peeling back the layers, exploring the nooks and the crannies, and following the threads gathered there across time. From there, I work upwards and outwards, asking how the histories in these particular places might change the way we understand some of the bigger stories we tell about our cities, our nation, and the world. In one sense, local histories are contained or geographically bound or specific, but they also have the potential to open up histories in new and important ways. They may be small in some ways, but they allow you to go deep and wide. And that, I think, can shift and refocus history. So while the stories I tell today are grounded, so to speak, in particular places, they're also about what happens when you deeply engage with the places around you, the material, spatial, geographical, and oral archives in place. So the book focuses on 3 places in Auckland, and I've got them all highlighted here on this map. The first is Pukikawa, or Auckland Domain, so that's the highlighted rectangle at the top there. Most of us will know Auckland Domain, very close to the CBD and the site of the Auckland War Memorial Museum where I work. The second place is Maunga Kiakea, also known as One Tree Hill and Cornwall Park, and that's the middle place on the map there. A working farm, also known, very familiar I'm sure to most if not all of you. It's New Zealand's largest pa, or defensive settlement, and it's been a working farm since the 1840s, and the place, of course, where a large obelisk sits on the summit. And the third place that I write about is the Otuatawa Stonefields at Ihumātao, the bottom place on the map there. They're in Mangere, next to the Auckland airport, and a place that was unknown to most people until 2009, when a large protest took place there against a planned housing development. Well, there are many places in Auckland that I could have written about. I could have started here, on these north-facing sheltered volcanic slopes of Mount Hobson or Ohiniro, land that's been so highly valued by Māori and Pākehā for many hundreds of years. I could have started right here with Remuera Road outside, the main pathway for Māori from the east into and out of Tamaki, or Auckland as it's now known, and now of course a major road leading down to Broadway, another old Māori pathway connecting the Waitemata and the Manukau Harbour. There are very long histories that have profoundly shaped this place where we are tonight. And I'll mention some more of those local histories where I can throughout the talk. Well, like this site, the places that I chose to write about, Pukikawa, Maunga Kiakea and Ihumātao, all have their own constellations of geographies and histories and identities. And each of them, I think, opens up a view shaft into lesser known histories that deepen and at times challenge the way we understand the past and the present in Auckland and in our cities more generally. So the book, for those of you who haven't read the book, and I'm sure there's a good many who haven't, it follows a loosely chronological framework from early human arrivals in New Zealand in around the 1300s through to the present day. And each chapter focuses on a material aspect of one of the landscapes at a particular moment in time, and then it follows those stories up to the present day. So there's a chapter on the early Māori Stonefield Gardens at Ihumātao. There's one on a house built in the domain for Potato Te Wherowhero by the early colonial government. There's another on a mission station at Ihumātao, one on an olive grove planted at Maunga Kiakea, another on a market garden run by the Archie family in the domain, and one on the building of the obelisk at Maunga Kiakea in the mid-20th century. And I've just got here some of the illustrations in the book that opened each of those chapters, because I think the designer did such a wonderful job and captured beautifully what I was trying to convey in words with her images. So she's used, for each of the chapter openers, she's used historic photographs and then pieced them together, and then she's highlighted in gold for each chapter the material aspect that I focus on in each chapter. So in this case here, it's a view of the stone fields, the rocks there in the front, looking out to the entrance to the Manukau Harbour. And in this one here, this is Maunga Kia on the left there with the olive grove in the foreground there in gold. And this one here is a chapter on the Archie Market Gardens, which these little straight lines, golden straight lines here with the remnant bush here on the domain, looking out towards Rangitoto. So let's have a look at a few of these places. And we'll start with the Otuataua stone fields at Ihumātao, a place that most people had never heard of a few years ago, certainly when I started writing this work as a PhD thesis 10 years ago. But it's better known today, and for very good reason. It's a place where people have been picking up rocks for more than 600 years and carrying them, turning them in their hands, arranging and rearranging them to make walls, garden structures, houses, pathways, roads, and more recently airport runways. Histories here reach back to some of the earliest residents of the place we now call Auckland, forming important but little known histories that still underpin the city. So the Otuataua stone fields were formed by the eruption of two volcanic cones, which produced lava flows that carried huge amounts of rock with them as they spilled out across the land, creating a very rough, dry landscape. And over time, fertile, well-drained volcanic soils formed on the lava fields that were perfect for gardening. These eruptions happened all over Auckland. There are around 50 volcanic cones in this city, giving it a very distinctive landscape, although many of them have since been quarried away. And you can see all those volcanic cones there on this very early map of Auckland that some of you may be familiar with from 1859 by Ferdinand von Hostetter, which shows all the volcanic cones in red, and then the lava flows surrounding them are those big pink pillowy circles around the cones. And you can see that those lava fields cover much of what is today the city of Auckland. And Mount Hobson is in there somewhere. You can normally pinpoint it, but this one here, I think. Oh, have I got that right? Yes. Yeah. Some nuts and John there. So I've just highlighted there in blue the stone fields area, and then I've just zoomed in. So these are the volcanic cones here that form the Otuataua stone fields. This one here has now been completely quarried away, the bottom one there called Maunga Taki. Otuataua itself, the middle one there, is still there, partially there, and Pukiiti or Pukitāpapa is the northern one there. That's the only one that's still complete. And here's a map of the same area here today, highlighted in red, showing the Otuataua Stonefields Historic Reserve in the green area, and the Ihumātao Papakainga, or ancestral village, just to the right of the reserve, just here, and of course the Auckland Airport right here. So Māori histories of Ihumātao and the wider area also begin with the formation of land and waters. And in one of those stories, a powerful ancestor called Mataaho formed all of Auckland's volcanic features, and his name is recorded in many of those features across the city, including Ihumātao, which is Te Ihu o Mataaho, or the nose of Mataaho. So place names like Ihumātao record some of the earliest histories in the city, and they also reveal notions of collective identity amongst Māori across the Auckland area that existed long before the city expanded to encompass most of the volcanic plateau. Well, the same broad group of people have been living in Ihumātao since the earliest days of human arrivals in the Auckland area, making it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously lived villages in the city. These deep histories have been recorded in Māori tribal histories and in the land itself, with archaeologists finding evidence of Māori living and gardening in the area from the 14 or 1500s. So you can see in this image here the various patterns and piles of rocks covering the landscape. on the stone fields, and there are many, many layers of occupation and different activities here across hundreds of years. And that includes the gardening activities of early Māori in Auckland, who planted the tropical crops that their Polynesian forebears brought with them to Aotearoa, kumara, taro, yam. Those crops grew very well in the fertile soils of Tamaki's lava fields, but Māori also used the rock strewn across the landscape to help create a warm, sheltered environment for those tropical crops in a subtropical environment. Drawing on the knowledge they brought with them from Polynesia, they cleared the loose volcanic rock from the lava fields to create cultivation areas. They piled up the rock onto existing ridges to create windbreaks, boundary walls and terraces, and they formed complex drainage systems for their gardens. Those rock wall systems across the stone fields served not only as gardening structures though, they were also named after particular ancestors and events. So there were places of historical memory as well, which in turn helped to define and organise the way the stone fields were lived in and gardened by particular family groups over generations. And the pathways in between that stonework guided people through the landscape, helping them navigate through tapu and noa areas. So as visitors walk through parts of those same stone fields today, they unwittingly still follow these earlier systems of gardening, occupation and memory that are hundreds of years old. Well, these stone field gardens like this once covered much of Auckland, all of those pink bits that we saw on that earlier map by Hochstetter. But almost all of the gardens have now been destroyed by urban development. The Otuatawa stone fields are one of the very few areas that are left. And as archaeologists have pointed out, these gardens tell the story of long, peaceful periods of settlement in Tamaki that have largely disappeared from the physical landscape and from the written record. So, Auckland history starts to look a bit different when you begin at a place like Ihumātao rather than starting at a place like Queen Street. Here, there are longer histories, reaching back to the earliest inhabitants of Auckland and telling of continuities and fluidities in Auckland's past that are important to know alongside those stories of constant warfare that are often told in our histories. And built onto those very deep histories on the stone fields, there are also more recent histories that offer different insights into colonial Auckland. So Tamaki, as pre-colonial Auckland was known, has often been portrayed as empty when Europeans first settled here in 1840. But when you look at a place like Ihumātao, a very different picture emerges. In the previous couple of decades, during the intertribal musket wars, Māori from across the Tamaki Isthmus had spent periods of time in Waikato under the protection of their leader, Pōtātou Te Wherowhero, who I'll mention again a little bit later. But throughout that time, they returned to Tamaki continually to replant their gardens and collect resources, and they moved back to their ancestral lands permanently in 1835. So by 1840, when Governor Hobson arrived to establish the government settlement of Auckland, Māori had resumed their seasonal patterns of planting, fishing, harvesting, and filling the storage pits on their lands. So Auckland, far from being empty or abandoned, was in fact a place full of movement across the land and waters in well-established patterns. And you can see those patterns on this map here behind me of tribal movements from 1820 to 1840. Here, places such as Ihumātao, which you can see in the red shaded area in the middle there, are shown as a meeting point each spring for a number of tribes, all related through shared ancestors who planted gardens for fishing parties and lived there during the summer months. And you can see here too how Remuera, at the top here, is also another one of those spaces that was intensely occupied at particular times of the year. Well, these rhythms were in operation when Europeans arrived in the area, and they continued after the colonial town of Auckland was established. So in the first few years of European settlement, Māori lost a lot of their land in the Auckland area, but there were still some places where Māori continued to live on their ancestral lands, and Ihumātao was one of those places. In 1848, there were around 200 Māori living at Ihumātao under the leadership of Epiha Putini, who was an influential leader in early Auckland, but who's completely disappeared from its histories. Well, in fact, Putini and Te Whero, who I mentioned earlier, and other Waikato leaders were also gifted land in Remuera by Ngāti Whātua after those musket wars I just talked about, in acknowledgement of their support and protection during the wars. And Putini, who converted to Christianity in the 1830s, apparently held the first Methodist service in Auckland on his land at Remuera in 1842. And it was on that land that the Remuera feast, or Hakari, was held in 1844. Some of you have no doubt seen this image here of the Remuera feast. Epiha Putini, the chief from Ihumātao, who I'm talking about, is circled there in the red. That's him galloping across the landscape, and his name was recorded there. It's not a great image, I'm afraid. So it was at Putini's request that a Methodist mission station was built at Ihumātao in the late 1840s on Māori land next to Putini's kainga or village and beside the gardens of the Otuatawa stone fields. You can see the mission station here in this painting done by the wife of one of the local ministers. So it had a cottage, a schoolhouse, a wooden chapel and dry stone walls for the gardens. And you can see the kainga here beside it, and that's again looking out over the Manukau Harbour towards the entrance to the harbour in the background there. So this is an image of Reverend Henry Laurie, who was the first missionary based at Ihumātao. So missionaries like Laurie tried to encourage Māori to settle in fixed locations and to follow their strict daily routines. But despite this, Māori continued their more fluid patterns of existence, and this in turn continued to shape the mission station and its wider networks. The missionaries noticed, for example, how Māori in the area continued to move between their tribal lands following those seasonal patterns of fishing, planting and harvesting along the lines of the map of movements I showed you earlier. So Laurie and others often complained that they weren't able to find their Māori congregation, so they had to follow them as they moved around their lands so they could continue to preach them. And as the missionaries travelled around the Manukau Harbour, visiting settlements in the waka provided by Māori, they were broadly following the pattern of movements that had been in place there for hundreds of years. As well as missionaries using existing Māori networks, Māori also began to use the missionary networks for their own purposes, often travelling between mission stations throughout Auckland and further afield. This is the earliest painting I've been able to find of the Ihumātao area, and I snuck it in there because it's painted by a woman called Caroline Abraham in 1852, who was the wife of Bishop Charles Abraham, the first Bishop of Wellington, and incidentally is also an ancestor of mine. And her paintings, there I was using them for my research, not realising that she was actually an ancestor, but they're now a really important historic document of Auckland because they're often the first pictorial portrayal of places in Auckland. But back to Ihumātao. So on those lava fields beside the mission station, Māori continued to cultivate their gardens, providing food for the mission station, their Pākehā neighbours, and for the nearby township of Auckland. They continued to grow kumara on the stone fields, but they also grew European crops such as potato, corn, wheat and oats, and they kept pigs, cows, chickens and horses. And the field systems there began to evolve there to reflect these changing agricultural practices. So this is an amazing map from 1854, first map of the Manukau Harbour, which is all these areas here. These are the channels in here, and Ihumātao is the area there in red. And if I just zoom in there, that's a zoom in of that area, and you can actually see the mission station there circled in red on just the edge there between. It's that says Umatoa, that's meant to be Ikumatau, that's a misspelling there, and another name there for Pukeiti. So you can see there that the large cultivation areas on the stone fields have now been organised into rectangular field systems in line with European methods of farming. So throughout the 1840s and 50s, there were very different relationships being formed at Ikumatau than those at the centre of town. It was not so much a site of cultural hegemony or a neo-Europe, as early Auckland has often been called, but more of a mixed place, one forged by both existing tribal dynamics and the structures of the British Empire, and one where the knowledge channels flowed both ways, from Māori to Pākehā, as well as vice versa. The sudden shift at Ikumatau happened not in 1840, when Māori histories of Auckland often end and Pākehā ones tend to begin, but later on in July 1863, when Māori were forcefully evicted from their ancestral lands at Ikumatau and other settlements around the Manukau Harbour, just days before the Waikato War officially began. And this moment brings the New Zealand Wars and its consequences into Auckland in a way that hasn't yet been sufficiently acknowledged in our histories. The raupatu, or the confiscations that took place after the war, had devastating and long-lasting consequences for its Māori communities. Now, in this 1866 survey map here, you can see how the Māori land there was surveyed and cut up and distributed amongst European settlers after the Waikato War. So those consequences have continued to ripple through wider Auckland and New Zealand ever since, and occasionally they bubble up to the surface, as we saw with the 2019 protests at Ikumatau. So they're important stories to know if we're to understand and come to terms with Auckland's past and its present. Now I'm going to move on now to the second place in my book. Are we okay for time?
Yeah.
Yeah? All right. Okay.
Well.
Good. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Pukekawa, or Auckland Domain. And here's an aerial view of the domain here, looking towards town. And you can see there, of course, the museum on the right, and the playing fields and the gardens, with the tea kiosk and the duck ponds just up here in this part over here, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. It's a place that most of you will be very familiar with, certainly more familiar with than the stone fields. And it's a fairly pleasant, picturesque landscape, and one that was actually largely created in the early 20th century, when much of the land there was drained and cleared and reformed for the 1913-14 industrial exhibition held there, and for the building of the museum shortly afterwards in 1929. But even here, in this carefully crafted landscape, there are places that tell longer and more complicated stories about Auckland's past. So the duck ponds in the domain, as they're known today, are freshwater springs, which were once part of a much larger wetland that was an important resource for Māori. It was drained in the 1860s to create the cricket grounds that are there now, reappeared again, of course, last year in the Auckland floods. And here I am in my walk during the floods. I didn't realise my t-shirt was going to be so on top of it. But it's a terrible photo, so I'm going to move on from that quickly and go back to the springs. So the springs were also an important resource in colonial Auckland. When the capital first moved to Auckland in 1840, the domain was actually part of the governor's grounds, which ran all the way from Old Government House, which is now on the grounds of the University of Auckland, across Stanley Street, which was a river at the time, and to the Auckland Domain. It was a large area now separated by a major road. Well, Governor Hobson planned to eventually build a new permanent residence right beside the springs, something that never eventuated because the capital, of course, ended up moving down to Wellington in 1865. But in preparation for his new house, Hobson began clearing the fern and converting the land in the domain to pasture for his horses. And it's the first area in central Auckland to be converted to pasture. Hobson also had a large garden built on the bank beside the springs, which was his own kitchen garden, but it was also New Zealand's first botanical garden. And this is the site of it right here on these banks of the springs there beside what's the tea kiosk and the ice cream kiosk today. So those gardens contained exotic flowers, fruit trees and seedlings, which were all collected from botanical gardens around the world, planted here in the domain, and then redistributed out to settlers and other gardens around the country. And so all signs of that garden have now long gone and been forgotten about. But in fact, it's one of the most important early colonial sites of the practices of collecting, organising and disseminating scientific and botanical knowledge in the country. And it's no coincidence, of course, that the hospital was built beside it, the medical school was there, and the museum was later built there, which has carried on with those collections with its herbarium of collecting and organising botanical specimens. This is an earlier photograph here of the gardens, looking from the site of the hospital over the domain with the springs, the ponds in the middle there, and the botanical gardens on the right with all of these big trees here. North here in the background there. So now within this rapidly evolving colonial landscape in the domain, there was also a cottage built for Potato Te Wherowhero, the leading Waikato chief who later became the first leader of the Kingitanga, or the Māori King movement. And here's an image of Potato Te Wherowhero here. So I mentioned him earlier when I was talking about Ihu Mātau. He had sheltered many of the Tamaki tribes in Waikato during the intertribal musket wars in the 1820s, and then he escorted them back to Tamaki in 1835. Te Wherowhero had a number of houses across Auckland that were gifted to him, and this was one of them. So the college was built in 1845 by the governor of the time, who was Robert Fitzroy, and it was built on a site close to the government gardens and right next to the governor's planned new residence, and that wasn't a coincidence. And the date of its construction is also important. It was right at the time that war was breaking out in Russell, or Kororareka, at the beginning of the Northern War of the New Zealand Wars. So Governor Fitzroy was wanting to secure the support of this powerful leader at a critical time for the country. The house was a strong statement of the mana of Te Wherowhero, of his close ties with the Crown, and of his central role in the future of Auckland. We're not exactly sure where the cottage was in the domain, and there have been a number of different theories about where it may have been, but my best guess from the historical records is that it was at the top of the ridge near the springs, looking out over the township of Auckland, one of the prime locations in town at the time. And it's actually the site now of the Auckland Hospital grounds, and specifically where the mental health unit is located. So I've got an arrow on the map here showing the location of the cottage there in yellow, and the springs in the middle there, and the government gardens in the white there. And this is an earlier map, an amazing map from 1860 that shows the domain, and the only thing it shows on the domain very specifically is Te Wherowhero's house and the fence of the garden. So we're trying to work out from there exactly where it was. Oh, I've even circled it for you. So that's where the springs are, and there's Te Wherowhero's house. So this is a painting from 1843 looking from the domain towards the town of Auckland, which I think is similar to the view that Te Wherowhero would have had from the steps of his cottage. And he can look straight down, and I've read that in the historic records, he had a very good view of Government House, which is just in the middle there of the painting. So while he was living at the cottage, Te Wherowhero met with the governor often to discuss the Treaty of Waitangi and other issues, but he also held a number of large hui in the domain with Māori leaders from around the country as he continued to build and shape the tribal alliances and dynamics in the wider area. And it's said that Te Wherowhero also gave a new meaning to the name Pukikawa while he lived there, a name that literally means sour hill but which he used to remember those who died in those intertribal musket wars of the 1820s and 1830s that I've been talking about, calling it the Hill of Bitter Tears. So Pukekawa is one of the very few places in Auckland where those wars are remembered, and it gives the 20th century museum built on Pukekawa much deeper foundations that reach into the ground and back across time. So here in the centre of colonial Auckland, we had both Crown leaders and Māori leaders coexisting in the same space, crafting very different but intersecting senses of identity and place, and both striving to maintain a fine balance at a critical time for Auckland and for New Zealand. Well, Te Wherowhero's cottage is now gone, and it's been forgotten about by most Aucklanders, but it's always been remembered by Māori. And in 1940, on the centennial of the township of Auckland, Te Wherowhero's great-granddaughter, Te Puia Herangi, who was by then the Kingitangi leader herself, planted a tōtara in the domain in memory of his presence there. The memorial still sits there quietly. Some of you may know it. It's unmarked. It sits right across from the museum today, reminding Aucklanders, I think, of those deep and ongoing histories that are woven through this place. And it's also the place where we had our little blessing for the book. It was right in the middle of the pandemic, so we had a very small, socially distanced little blessing on that site, and it was a wonderful place to bring the book into the world. So from the late 19th century, there's yet another layer in the domain. After the government moved to Wellington in 1865, the botanical gardens by the springs became neglected, and they were soon taken over by a Chinese market gardener. And further down the hill, at the bottom of the domain, Chan Ah-Chi and his family established their home and market gardens alongside one of the rivers that flowed from the springs. So this is a bird's eye view of the city here in 1885. And you've got the domain down here in this part of the image. And you can see the Queen Street Wharf at the top there. And the domain springs are here in the middle, still there. Just below them, the government gardens, which are now being run by Yek Li, a Chinese market gardener. And at the bottom of the hill, bordering on to what's now Stanley Street, you've got the Ah-Chi Market Gardens at the bottom of Parnell Rise, for those of you that know it. And here is the Ah-Chi family here. Chan Ah-Chi with his grandchildren and his nieces and nephews. Well, the Ah-Chi family lived at the foot of the domain from 1882 to 1920, when they were removed to make way for the rugby league stadium, Makaurau Park, which many of you I'm sure will remember. So like the cottage of Te Wherowhero and the Ah-Chi gardens, they were subsequently forgotten about until 2007, when Makaurau Park itself was destroyed and archaeologists went in and uncovered these traces of the Ah-Chi house and gardens underneath. So the hundreds of gardening and cooking and recreational items found on the site opened up a world that's largely been left out of histories of Auckland and erased from the land. And here are a few of the items found during that excavation, and some of them are now on display in the Auckland Museum. What those excavations found were glimpses of a family that had one of the most successful fruit and vegetable businesses in Auckland in the early 20th century. The Ah-Chis supplied fresh produce to many of the city's households and restaurants, as well as to the newly developing international cruise ship industry. And they also had extensive networks throughout New Zealand and around the world, including with China and America. So it's a family that went on later to open the first supermarket in New Zealand, which they called Food Town. And all the while at home in the domain, the Ah-Chis were carefully navigating the European settler practices and expectations of the time, while also implementing their own ideas, practices and networks. And among the Chinese brownware and the ginger jars and the rice bowls, they also found an English Royal Doulton teapot and teacups, and here's one of them here. And these were used to entertain European guests. And you can see that it's a standard English willow design here on the teacup. But that's a design, of course, that actually derived from 18th century Chinese porcelain designs. So the teacup itself tells its own story of mutual English and Chinese borrowings over hundreds of years. So here in the domain, underneath the carefully crafted 20th century landscape, there are earlier stories of relationships between people and their natural environment, the springs, the rivers, the gardens. There are deeper histories of war and commemoration. There are important relationships between the Crown and Māori leaders. And there are early Chinese histories that had a significant impact on the city. These stories are all right there in the centre of our city, but they're hard to see until you start peeling back the layers of the land and bringing them to the surface. Now, I've got one more place I can talk about.
Yeah.
How are we doing?
45 minutes, so yeah.
Oh gosh, okay,
Yeah.
well I've only got a few more minutes to talk, so bear with me. So I'll talk just a little bit here about one story from the book on Maunga Kēkea, or One Tree Hill. And today I'm just going to look at one of those stories, and that's the story about a remnant olive grove at Maunga Kēkea, which was planted by John Logan Campbell in 1878. There's John Logan Campbell on the day that he was handing Cornwall Park over to the citizens of New Zealand, 1903, and here's the olive grove I'm just going to talk a little bit about, which some of you may know. So it's a grove that's always looked very out of place to me in the pastoral landscape of Cornwall Park. And it's out of place as well with histories of this era, which often describe New Zealand in the late 19th century as the Britain of the South. And they tend to focus on the mass conversion of the land to grass. But Campbell ran this olive grove as a commercial venture for over 20 years. And I think when you look more closely at the grove, you start to see that some 19th century settlers of Auckland may not have been trying to create a little Britain. They may have been crafting a broader sense of place here. Here's a map of Maunga Kēkea here showing the extent of the olive grove, which goes down into what's now Cornwall Cricket Club. And I'll talk about that other bit in just a second. So we now know, of course, that our climate and geography in New Zealand are well suited to growing olives. But back in the 1870s, Campbell was one of a small but vocal group of individuals who were trying to develop products for non-British markets like Spain, Italy, France and the United States. So in 1878, Campbell brought over 5,000 seedlings from Australia and planted them on a plateau. So that's the small oval red shaded area there, which is now where Hui Lodges and Acacia Cottage, which many of you I'm sure will know. Well, that was his nursery for his vineyard and for his olive grove initially. So as well as the olive grove, he planted a vineyard which didn't survive, and he also planned to build an Italianate home on the property on that same plateau, as well as a campanile, which is an Italian bell tower on the summit of Maunga Kēkea, or One Tree Hill, which obviously didn't eventuate either. Well, after trying and failing to graft the olive seedlings with more imported stock from Australia, Campbell paid a very skilled Canadian orchardist to do the grafting work for him. And once that was done, the seedlings were planted out over the slopes of the terraces, where some of them remain today. And here's a photo here of the young olive grove, looking north with Mount St John on the left and Mount Hobson or Pinero on the right, and you can see Green Lane Hospital there on the upper left part of the image. So the ground on which the olive trees was planted had once been part of an extensive and very famous Māori gardening area at Maunga Kēkea in the 1700s. And when archaeologists recently did some work on the olive grove, they found that the topsoil there was full of finely fragmented shellfish, which had washed down the terraces from above over time. So that sheltered northwestern slope with its fertile volcanic soils mixed through with shells from the middens created a perfect free-draining site for the the olive grove. And for most of the period that Campbell was developing the grove, there was also a Chinese-run market garden beneath the trees. And here is Min Kwong, who was running the market garden underneath those trees. So it's been assumed that Campbell had given up on the grove and leased it as a market garden, but actually the grove was thriving. And as some newspaper reporters observed at the time, it was partly because of the market gardeners who were constantly ploughing and weeding and applying manure to the grove. Here's another slightly later photo of the grove. Here you can see it's pretty densely planted at that time. But when it came to carrying out the first pressing of the olives, Campbell, being a Scotsman, had very little knowledge of how to do it. So he sought the help of an Italian vintner called Giovanni Federli, who was touring around New Zealand trying to set up vineyards and orchards throughout the country. Federli spent a week overseeing the pressing operations, and at the end of it he declared it a great success, calling the olive oil equal to the best in Italy. Well, the next step for Campbell was to try and break into the international markets, and he sent samples of his olives and his olive oil to Portugal, where they were received very favourably, but he also sent a whole lot to California, which leaked on the way there, and they were turned down by his agent in San Francisco, who told Campbell that he was still trying to get the disagreeable bitter taste of the Auckland olives out of his palate. Well, Campbell endured and carried on and continued to experiment with olives throughout the 1890s, but he was let down by a lack of equipment and technical knowledge. And in the meantime, of course, refrigeration was invented, and mutton, beef and dairy products began to dominate the New Zealand economy. So the commercial olive grove didn't last, and it would be 100 years before another one was planted in New Zealand. But what it shows, I think, is that even on the property of one of the most prominent, successful British settlers in Auckland, there were alternative articulations of empire at work. The grove had no single lineage. It was a mixture of Māori, North American, Italian, Chinese and British influences. So here in this forgotten corner of an iconic landscape, we can see those finer, more varied workings of a local community over time, as well as those wider, big international networks that were generated from this place. A couple of years ago, some award-winning olive makers from Waiheke decided to produce olive oil from the olive grove for the first time in over 100 years. And they said it was one of the finest olive oils they'd ever tasted. And I was lucky enough to be given a bottle, and here it is, from a very small batch, and I can confirm that it was absolutely beautiful. So, 3 places in Auckland, all with very different histories. What do they tell us about Auckland's history, and how might they change the way we look at the histories of our own towns and cities? Well, I think to begin with, these places bring the physical environment into our histories in ways that often get overlooked. Auckland's lava fields, its kumara gardens, its trees, its freshwater springs, its rivers and its harbours have actively influenced where and how people have lived across the city since they first arrived in around the 1300s. Secondly, I think when you explore the layers of history embedded in places, you start to see those longer human connections between the deep past and the present. You can't understand Auckland history today if you look at it with a short lens, if you start this century, or last, or even the one before that. There are deep Māori histories and networks and knowledge that have profoundly shaped this city, and they continue to do so. And thirdly, I think these places all show more complex colonial histories of Auckland. This city becomes a place that is at once Indigenous, settler and international, with Māori tribal networks, missionary circuits, Chinese trading practices, raupatu or confiscation, and Mediterranean connections, all present alongside those structures of the British Empire that have preoccupied historians. When you explore the finer workings of a place over time, you start to see the unevenness of collective memory, the making, the remaking, the forgetting, the remembering of histories over time. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, these places resist a singular, authoritative story about Auckland. When you start with the histories at your feet, it opens up history. It makes room for the voices and the silences, for the presence and the absence that makes up our past. Thank you.